Hello, and a very warm welcome to this event on levelling up. What is it and does it work? With me, Bronwen Maddox, I'm the director, Neil O'Brien and Sebastian Payne. I'm going to plunge straight into housekeeping, or my team will not going to forgive me. We're very pleased to have an audience, a very large audience, I think even possibly one of our record ones, joining us online, and many people in the room as well. Very warm welcome to you as well. We're going to be live tweeting from IFG events using the hashtag IFG Levelling Up. Sorry, it's a long one. It's levelling up with 2 L's in the middle for those who are inclined to go the American way. Please do follow and tweet along. Those of you watching online, please do send in your questions as early as you like. That means now. And we always love to know who you are, or your first name, and where you're watching from, if you can do that. You can put your questions in the panel on the right of your screen, and we will get them right away. And we're, of course, going to call on members of the audience here as well. And we've got microphones in the old-fashioned, now resurrected way. We're going to have our video and sound recording on our website within 24 hours, thanks to the excellent IFG team. And so I don't have to give an awful lot of introduction, I think, but Neil O'Brien is a Conservative MP for Harborough and has been Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities since September last year. He was previously an advisor to Theresa May as Prime Minister on industrial policy, and also worked as an advisor to George Osborne on the Northern Powerhouse. Sebastian Payne is Whitehall Editor at the Financial Times and has published this book, which I can wave. He can probably wave on too, right?
Exactly.
Which is much harder on Zoom. You're Neil, you're allowed to wave a copy of the white paper, though we have waved that very large document from this platform before. So, and Sebastian's previously been a reporter and at the Spectator and Daily Telegraph. This book, Broken Heartlands, was published in September last year and covered his journey through seats in the Midlands and north of England, including Gateshead, where he grew up, the so-called Red Wall, and looked at what is happening there and why those seats switched to voting Conservative in 2019. So lots to discuss here. Very warm welcome, though, first to both of you. Thanks for breaking off very busy days. I wanted to start with you, Neil, and just say it's a couple of months since the white paper came out. It's a very large document, much analysed by now. What's happened since then?
So all those different things, those priorities that we set out in the white paper, we've started to put into operation. So as you remember, there were 4 broad themes to the white paper about, broadly speaking, improving economic performance, spreading opportunity and improving public services, improving quality of life in pride of place, and then extending devolution and empowering local leaders. Those are the kind of 4 headings of what levelling up is fundamentally about. And on all 4 of those, we have been making progress since we published the white paper. So one of the themes of the levelling up white paper, as you would know, is to do things slightly differently to some previous efforts at what you would have called kind of regional policy in the past. And one of the ways in which we are trying to do things differently, is to I think not just about kind of specific funding for levelling up, the Levelling Up Fund, the Shared Prosperity Fund, the Community Renewal Fund, all these different things we've got, but to actually go after the totality of public spending, to think about the cake rather than just the cherry on the cake. And so we've started the process of rethinking some of how we deliver those kind of large government budgets. So we set an ambition in the white paper, for example, to grow the amount of public investment in research and development outside the Greater South East by 1/3 over the next 3 years, a very, very rapid rate of increase. So BEIS are now working through, they published the kind of first step in that. We're now working through the steps of how we actually deliver that. We've set up the 3 innovation accelerators that we announced in the white paper in Glasgow and in Greater Manchester in the West Midlands, and they are now starting to meet. People are beginning to draw up their plans. And the same would be true of things like housing funding, where we have got rid of the so-called 80-20 rule that tended to put more money in the southeast. We've started to reshape culture spending as well, with announcements on that, and the uplift in the culture budget going outside the capital into places where culture spending has been lower. So the great work of kind of reshaping public spending to target places that are struggling in different ways has begun. On the kind of opportunity front, we literally just yesterday published the schools white paper, the next steps in terms of improving the performance of the school system, getting more schools into really good families of schools, multi-academy trusts, doing more on tutoring to hit that mission we set out in the white paper on improving basic numeracy and literacy in primary schools and basic skills. In terms of Pride in Place, the Chancellor in his spring statement announced the opening of the next round of the Levelling Up Fund, which helps to do some of those things. And in the coming weeks, in the very near future, we will finally announce the Shared Prosperity Fund that helps places to deliver those kind of improvements to the local community, to the town centre, to the local park, those kind of things that are important for quality of life in the local place. And finally, on that last theme about devolution and local empowerment, we've started devolution discussions with a very large number of places. And so I've been meeting with my local government colleagues in Cornwall, in Devon, Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, Leicestershire, Norfolk, Suffolk, Hull and East Yorkshire, North Yorkshire and York, Durham, the North East. I'm basically doing a tour of all the places that Seb's very reasonably priced book talks about, and being up in Blythe, seeing for myself some of the issues that Seb talks about. So on that front, we're hammering away, and I'm glad to say that a lot of places are really going for kind of ambitious devolution agreements and are interested in new structures, directly elected local leaders over big geographies. So that is going very excitingly. Sorry, that's a long answer to a short question. I'm so sorry, but there's a lot going on all these fronts.
All right, thanks. There's a lot you've said there that we can pick up on. I don't want to come back to the devolution points, but you mentioned in that the spring statement last week, obviously very dominated by questions of cost of living, of energy, and so on. But a small cry did go up. There doesn't seem to be a lot about levelling up in the spring statement. What would you say to that?
So I'd say the contents of the spring statement did do levelling up to the £500 million in terms of community support for the most vulnerable. Some of the other changes that are kicking in, and this goes to the point I was trying to make about levelling up is not just about some fund that's called levelling up, it's about the totality of what you do with the tax and benefit system and total public spending. So for example, I would say that the changes to the UC taper rate, which will leave something like 2 million people 1,000 better off with full-time workers, that is a huge piece of levelling up. Or the national living wage, which is obviously just about to go up, will be one of the highest national minimum wages anywhere in the world. Again, making a full-time worker about £1,000 better off. That, although that's not traditionally been thought of as regional policy, some of those tools are our most powerful tools for levelling up. They're just not called a levelling up fund. It's about changing the way government does business, or as Andy Haldane puts it, changing the wire of Whitehall in a fundamental way.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Sebastian, I wonder if you could give us your view, just before we plunge into some more of the detail, on the government's account of levelling up. We've here at the IFG put out many times a chart on how many governments over the decades, never mind years, have come up with their own version of regional policy and other things for further education and so on. But governments for ages have wanted to do something about regional policy, and they've had a go at it under different banners. What do you make of this government's attempt as encapsulated in that white paper?
Well, the funny thing about levelling up was it's a policy to try and fit a slogan, and it was when Boris Johnson stood outside Downing Street after the 2019 election and said, we're going to get Brexit done, unite the country and level up. And then after that, people thought, crikey, levelling up, what's that? We're going to have to think of something to fit within that. And I think what has developed in the 2 years since that election, 2.5 years almost now, is looking at this issue of regional policy. And I think when Neil worked for George Osborne and for Theresa May, and of course a lot of this started with Mrs May with the the just about managings, which I think was an earlier incarnation of trying to have a go at this issue of regional inequality. I think the white paper itself is the first real serious attempt to look at how you address those issues that were exposed in the 2016 Brexit referendum, the 2019 general election, and it's trying to build on what's happened in the past, because as I looked at through the book's journey. You know, Howard Wilson tried this in the 1960s. Michael Heseltine tried it in the 1990s. Tony Blair tried it in the early noughties. George Osborne tried it with the Northern Powerhouse. They're all trying to address this same question. The fact is that the country is too centralised, its growth is too much in one place, and there's too much power held in one place. And I think the white paper does speak to all those themes. My question, I think this goes to what Neil was talking about, is what we're talking about here would be the biggest transformation in the British state in literally hundreds of years. It's as a big challenge as Brexit. Is there enough capacity, time, grip and money to actually deliver it within the 2030 targets that are set out there? And more practically, is there enough time in 2 years to get the government enough to say, to go to the country in the spring of 24 and say, look, we've had a bash at this, here's a down payment on levelling up, please give us another 5 years and we could do more. There is an interesting question about whether Labour will actually sign up to the 12 missions, which I think they actually could, because if you listen to Lisa Nandy, who is the chief spokesperson for Labour on this, she's very positive about the overall aspirations. I think she might differ about how exactly you get there. But it is extraordinary that this defining domestic mission has got a lot of political unity from both sides, and that is what's different from the past efforts of doing this, that before, when it was the Northern Powerhouse, Labour was quite critical of it. When it was Michael Heseltine and the enterprise zones, again, Labour was quite critical of it. And again, with Howard Wilson, his new towns in the 60s, that then Tories were very critical. Now, we have total political unity that this is the thing that needs to be done. This is the most important domestic policy challenge facing the country after the cost of living crisis. So I think it's a great opportunity, but really, it's going to all be about delivery and proving you can actually do these things, because we've tried it before, and I just do wonder, with everything else facing the government, not least cost of living, inflation, the war in Ukraine, is there going to be the capacity to get enough progress in 2 years to hit the 8-year progress?
All right, so I want to come on to these questions of delivery, which you've put your finger on, which hang there, because for all that you say, look, Labour has disagreed with some previous manifestations of these aspirations. This is an aspirational programme, and not many politicians would remove themselves from that aspiration. It's a way of talking about inequality by a Conservative Prime Minister, but it builds in aspiration into it, but makes many claims, or at least targets for that, from economic to devolution of power to cultural and so on. Neil, short time. Let's start with the power question that Sebastian raised. What, and you talk about devolution, what can be done, say in the next 2 years, on specifically that sharing out power and moving power out of Westminster?
Well, I think quite a lot. I think you make a good point. So your chart about the 40 different regional schemes we've had over the last 40 years, I think we actually borrowed for the white paper, because it is a good point that there's this constant chopping and changing of emphasis and schemes and so on. And one of the important things about local devolution is, as well as having someone who can bring together all the different policies you need to get growth going in one place. The skills spending, the transport investments, the planning, the digital infrastructure and so on, into a coherent plan. The other thing that stronger local leadership can give you is also consistency, longevity, and a sense of a plan for a place that can survive the chopping and changing of ministers and governments over time. And it's difficult to find examples of places that have really turned themselves around economically without that kind of strong leadership. And in particular, the model that
strong local leadership.
Strong local leadership, I mean to say. And the model we've gone for are the kind of directly elected mayors across city regions. I think is our best go yet at trying to find a geography that can really work. So everyone knows the history in the UK. We always had a relatively centralised country compared to some other peers like Germany. Over successive waves, it became more and more centralised. Mrs. Thatcher took out the GLC and the metropolitan county councils because you had the loony left, and it was just a destructive approach from some of those councils. We then tried to go around local councils with things like urban development corporations. We just like the councils. Derek Hatton is so terrible, we cannot do anything with him. We just got to go around him. And then, in the Labour years, you had regionalism. We're going to have these things at very large scale. We're going to have the southeast of England, the southwest, and so on. Good scale, but no directly elected leadership. the first time we tried to do elected leadership for these things in the Northeast, it was rejected by 80% of people in the Northeast in the referendum. And that was because it just wasn't a fit for the local identity. And so we're now on a different geography, a bit smaller, Teesside, for example, and that, I think, is a model that is going to stick, he said, knocking on wood, because...
That's not wood, but anyway, point taken, yeah.
This is going even worse than I feared. I think it does now, we've got something that is the balance between a decent scale, so you can actually persuade Whitehall departments to devolve significant powers to it. It's not just a tiny council with 20 people in it. And on the other hand, it actually fits with local geographies, real places, so not points of the compass like the Northwest, but Greater Manchester, Merseyside, South Yorkshire, places that people can identify with, and people that they know they are, right? It's not some county council who's in charge. It's like, Andy Street, Ben Houchin.
I was going to just say on that, when I spoke to David Miliband in the course of the book, he actually said that was one of New Labour's mistakes, that they believed in devolution, but going for the concept of a region just didn't fit with people at all, because no one thinks about themselves from coming from a region. One of the things I did a lot in the journey is to ask people I met, when you go on holiday, where do you say you come from? And that tells you an awful lot about people's identity. So do you...
And what did they say?
So the interesting example of this is so when I was in Hayward and Middleton, which is on the northern outskirts of Manchester, in Hayward, they all say they come from Lancashire. In Middleton, they all say they come from Manchester. Nobody says they come from Greater Manchester. Nobody says they come from the Northwest. And a lot of them still go on about the pre-1974 boundaries of counties, but that's a particularly older demographic, shall we say. But I think that's why this is one thing that I think is interesting about the idea of your regional governors that I think has been talked about. You talked about Teesside, but you also talked about a mayor in Cornwall. Cornwall's a lot bigger than Teesside and doesn't have a simple coherent identity. What do you do about that?
Well, it's physically a bit bigger, it's slightly fewer people, and it's got a very strong sense of identity and has, in fairness, had
if you compare North to South Cornwall, they might have a different view on that.
No, all these places, they have diversity within them as well, and we always try to recognise that, and there's different things that different places want. But I do think that there is, there's a lot of things about the Cornish identity, from the food to the flag to the language to 101 other things. So I think it is a fit that will kind of endure, and it lets us fill that gap, because in the UK we just had central government, and then you've potentially had Rutland Council, 40,000 residents, and nothing in between. There hasn't been something that Whitehall Departments has been prepared to give significant powers to, because it's at the right scale. So, and I think it's making a huge difference. I was talking to Andy Street's team, who do adult skills, and they're doing some things that they're just doing it better than central government used to when we ran it. There's less bums on seats, it's higher quality stuff. Yeah. But they're also doing some stuff we could never have done from Whitehall, right? They are getting coordination between their local colleges, so they don't all try and put on the same course at the same time. That one will specialise in this and the other in that. And that can only be done at that level. It couldn't be done more locally, and it couldn't be done nationally. So I do think there is all kinds of opportunities being unlocked by this programme.
So we're talking, you've both been talking about local identity and the strength of local identity, and you've been talking about more recognition of that in having more representatives, and a bit about what mayors can do. But I'm wondering about the money, and whether there's also an increase of power as well as that in what these people can do. Sebastian, what's your take on this? How much money is needed? Because one of the things we found has tripped up these regional strategies for years and years is when it comes down to it, central government, at just that point, and everyone's talked about regional identity and all this, and at just that point of giving either significant tax raising powers locally or much more money from central government, it just somehow doesn't happen.
Well, I think that's the exact issue. There's, I think, 139 pots that Neil's department has identified of money that goes to various local government for various schemes, and I could probably name 5 of them. Don't know about the 134. You can do that later. And the issue with that is that there's no coherence to where that spending is going, what it's being used for. There needs to be, obviously, in my view, a lot more money that's been put forward now. And of course, those 2030 goals, we've got several more spending reviews to happen before then, a lot more budgets. There are more opportunities to have a bite at the cherry. But for me, one of the things that was maybe a little bit lacking in the white paper was this issue about skills and the sort of buy-in from DFE and the Department for Work and Pensions, because I think investing in local governments, and there's no doubt about it, we've had £100 billion has been cut from local governments over the past decade. The central government funding has been cut by 70% since 2010, and the government's argument is they had to do that due to the financial crisis, but that does mean strategic capacity at local level has really gone, and that's a big problem for trying to redevelop things, having to build that back up. So in some ways, I think you need to be spending a lot of money now on local government and on further education and on developing skills that can then try and achieve your goals of reducing, improving life expectancy, reducing literacy and innumeracy. So, and one of the things that's often compared to on this is when Germany was unified, there was trillions, I think, of fiscal transfers that went from west to east to try and just throw money at all these issues. And East Germany still lags behind on nearly every major public policy indicator from the west. So this stuff is not easy. And I think there is still a skepticism from the Treasury, if I might be allowed to say that, about this agenda, because the Treasury's mindset is always the best return for money. Where do you get that? London, the southeast. And they've obviously ripped up the Green Book to try and challenge that. But I still get the general sense that if Neil was sitting in there and was able to just open a checkbook, there's so many more things you'd like to spend money on than is maybe kicking around at the moment.
I mean, this point about the Treasury is not one to be delicate or coy about. How do you answer this?
There's several parts. I don't think that is quite right. You're completely right about the need for the right structures and local leadership. Let me give you an example of that, which is in research and development, obviously crucial to growth, high-tech jobs, new good jobs, and so on. And we've had several bites of this. I mean, in the audience is John Godfrey, who was my boss at Number 10 Policy Unit, and then when we were doing that, we did the local industrial strategies, which were about trying to get an assessment of what the scientific strengths of different places were. And although lots of things intervened, and we had Brexit, and blah, 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 we are now, through the innovation accelerators that we set up in the white paper, now building on those, so all that work that was done for them can flow into to the creation of those things. And so what we're doing in R&D is to do several things at once. So firstly, you set an overall target, a huge increase in that spend outside the Greater Southeast. Why are we doing that? Why are we, for the first time, setting regional targets for R&D spending, which we've never done before? Well, it's because we've seen, since 1997, a growing concentration of public spending in just 3 cities of Oxford, Cambridge, and London. They're all great cities. They're all very important. We don't want to starve them. Their budgets will continue to increase dramatically in real terms. But we also want to spend a decent wedge of that in the scientific and industrial strengths of the rest of the country as well. Recognizing that there's been that concentration. So you could just set a target and then we all, from Whitehall, go and do the business. But I think you need more than that. You need to create the institutions that will bring together a vision for what is achievable in different places and will bend those wider spending streams towards what is locally important in each of those places. In Glasgow, there's all sorts of exciting things around quantum, optoelectronics, all that kind of stuff. In the West Midlands, all kinds of exciting things around EV and battery electric, and so on and so forth. And trying to make all of these disparate Whitehall silos, all of our different funding councils, university funding, all sing.
Power. Do you have the power to sit there and survey these 139 different pots of money, if you like, and say, look, this is where it's going to go?
Yeah, so we have a commitment in the white paper to work towards funding consolidation, to having a few of these pots more joined up. We've already made some good progress on that in transport for the large cities with what we call the Sustainable City Region Transport Settlements, known in the trade as the crusts. And that brings together a bunch of different funding streams for transport and tops them up so they can do more. That's a good example of where we can potentially go through the new devolution deals and the deepening of the devolution deals we've already got for places like the West Midlands and Greater Manchester, to bring more things into those single pots so you can move money around to fit local priorities, and just to get away from the problem of lots of little pots, competitively allocated, coming and going, different rules every time, spending lots of money, bidding for things. There's some good things about competitive funding, and that's an important part of the diet. But you need to have a balanced diet, and you need to have a base load of predictable funding as well, and that's why we're setting up the UK Shared Prosperity Fund as a kind of non-competitive allocated fund, so you know where you stand, and then you can have, as I say, a sort of balanced diet.
Sebastian, how much do you think this is an answer? As you were describing the East German example, which is relevant in some ways, this is a huge amount of money over decades with no challenge, political challenge, everyone committed. to this particular mission, and still, as you say, and as is very evident, parts of East Germany lag behind. Does Britain have the money, and is this government allocating the money to make this realistic?
I think the thing that's important about this is the fact that this is going to be the terrain the next general election is going to be fought on, because the Tories can't stay in power unless they hold on to as much of the red wall as possible, and Labour can't get back into power if it doesn't take back some of it. So in some ways, Sedgefield is the new bellwether seat that is going to dictate where politics goes, and those are the places that are going to be most targeted by the levelling up agenda. So there's a real political drive to make this at the front and centre of things and ensure there is more money. And there's obviously fiscal tensions within the government, as we saw in the spring statement, about do you spend, do you look at tax cuts, and of course there was, I think, £150 billion of new day-to-day Whitehall spending in the budget last year, and we should not scoff at that. That is a lot of money, but in many ways that is just rebuilding what was cut over the past decade due to the austerity years. And the question is, as I said, that brings you back up to a good level where you can start to improve things, but where do you then go after that? And I think consolidation is a really important part of this, because it's very difficult, I think, for the government to argue you're putting lots of money when you're doing X, Y, and Z and all these things. And you mentioned the Shared Prosperity Fund, Neil. We've got to mention that obviously a lot of money is going to be cut from the EU's regional development funds, that obviously a lot of money went to places like, if you go to North Shields in the North East, for example, the whole fish quay was paid for by the EU, and North Shields had one of the biggest Brexit votes in the country. And there's been, I think, some FT reporting about the question about whether the Shared Prosperity Fund is going to make up for all the money that was taken away when we left the EU.
Well, you'll have to wait not too much longer to have the exact numbers for every place, but I was talking to the leader of the council there the other day, and this point to me as well, it's a point I completely understand. We have committed to on that particular point, to matching what was spent by those EU structural funds for each of the nations. So we're completely sympathetic to the point, and it's one that is reinforced for me when I meet local leaders. But on this point about East Germany is a really good one, because I have often prayed that point in aid, and the Prime Minister talked a lot about it in his speech last summer. But actually, it's sort of reinforcing the point we're making. So sometimes you see big numbers about what was spent in East Germany, but there's a good report by the Haller Institute on all this. Those numbers include the totality of public spending, so they're including what we would call welfare transfers, unemployment benefit and so on. And so in one sense we need to be careful about the numbers, because they're not just funding for growth and so on, they are all of public spending. On the other hand, actually, yes, that's the right approach, because you've got to think about the totality of public spending. So I was up in Blyth the other day, one of the places that Seb talks about in his book, and one of the big opportunities there is the growth of the offshore wind industry, building Dogger Bank, the world's biggest offshore wind farm, humongous undertaking, huge pieces of machinery on the quayside, the world's biggest turbine blade, yada yada, single turn of one of these things can power a house for a day. Humongous undertaking. It's a bit like Aberdeen, but for wind. And so the challenge for us is we are spending a lot of money on this stuff, right? Quite rightly, you're trying to get energy security and go net zero. How do we drive more of that to be UK content? How do we get more benefit for places like Blyth from that? As it happens, a lot of net zero spending tends naturally towards places that are in need of levelling up. You don't build it in the middle of London, right? But nonetheless, you can always do more with each of these things. So it's not like we'd all like to have infinite money to spend on endless things. The truth is, it all comes out of taxpayers' pockets in the end, and a tax system is one of the ways you can do levelling up. And through the research I've done on this before, I'm very struck by the way that the growth of universal credit and its predecessors, and the national living wage and its predecessors, have tended to narrow those income differences at the bottom end. There's been divergence at the top end over the period since '97, but they are important levelling up tools. But there's no point, massively increasing tax on ordinary working people in order to just recycle the funding. We'll always have to think about, a certain amount of funding, but think about how you use that better in order to drive levelling up. But there's some tough choices there. So one thing, just to pick up on something that Seb said that I didn't agree with. Treasury, quite rightly, will always be focused on value for money. The question is, what is value for money, right? And the danger, actually, with some of these things, like our old ways of spending on regeneration and housing and so on, is you create, when we talk about this in the white paper, vicious and virtuous cycles where for the places that are already booming, you're pumping in more transport spending to respond to the congestion. You're putting in more housing spending to respond to the high house prices. And you end up in the odd situation where you're kind of, for the overheating places, you're pouring petrol on the fire, hoping to put it out. And for the places where, where the plants aren't growing, you're saying, well, we won't water you until you start growing, right? It's sort of like you're kicking off these cycles, and you've got to think about how isn't there actually more value for money sometimes in saying, well, actually, look, there's huge underuse of resources, there's an output gap, there's people who are underemployed in this place, and we could use some of these. Becky is taking a slightly long-term view of what is the best value for money. Sometimes a short-term view of that as well.
All right, thank you for mentioning net zero and how that fits in, because I'm getting a lot of questions on that as well. Sebastian, just before we go to wider questions, how do you think this is, specifically levelling up, is going to play in the May the 5th local elections? Because obviously we've got this enormous cost of living worries out there.
So I think obviously Conservative candidates will be going out and pointing at all the physical things they possibly can to say, look, we're doing stuff for you. Because one of the things I mentioned in the book is that after the 2019 election, somebody turned to Dominic Cummings and said, what do we do now? And his response was, build shit in the north. And that's kind of exactly what the government's been trying to do since then. And you've obviously got these new hospitals, there's the railways work, there's roads, you name it. So I think you're starting to see these physical manifestations of levelling up appear in the local elections. That will be, I think, an example of that, combined with, I'm sure, a message in certain counties like Wandsworth about low taxation and that usual sort of thing. But I think this points to the challenge for May 2024, when we sort of assume the next election is going to be. Because at that point, a lot of this stuff is longer-term structural change in how government money is spent. And it's very important, but it's not easy if you're living in, one of the red wall seats to understand exactly how the Treasury's sort of investment cycle is going to improve your life. And in a very real sense, there has got to be a lot of physical stuff, I think, for people to be convinced this is changing, and that is happening. And whether it's a new, I went to Ashfield in the East Midlands, quite near your patch, Neil, and it was during the row about MP's second jobs, and it took me an hour to find anyone who cared about that. And all they could talk about was the fact they were getting a new leisure centre. And I wrote this, and I got the most unbelievable amount of abuse from FT readers saying, how can people not be wound up about this cronyist government, etc., etc. But in Ashfield, literally all they could say is, look, we're getting this brand new leisure centre, and we've got a Four Seasons tribute band coming to open it in the coming months, and that's really going to change our local town.
I think on this point about
that has to count as a really positive message for your election campaign, doesn't it?
I think at this point about the physical, it is important. Some of these changes are very visible. The rail plan, 96 billion of spending, a whole new rail line between Warrington and Marsden, very big physical things. I come down on the train every morning from Leicestershire. I can see the electrification snaking north as I go south. It's a big physical thing. Some of the things are not physical, but they're tangible. Project Gigabit, humongous increases in connectivity to gigabit internet. From, I think the stat I had written down was like less than 10% at the end of 2019 had gigabit internet. It's now 60%, right, in the space of despite all the pandemic and everything. So they're quite physical changes. You'll be able to get a better mobile reception, because what we're doing with the shared rural network, sort of physical investments. But it is also, I think, not just pointing at things as Seb says, it is also a general sense of prosperity and, is the economy doing better? And some of the things that we're doing are a bit less visible, not politically very sexy. The expansion of the British Business Bank's SME lending to all of the northeast, to the southwest, and to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Not a sexy political subject, but will really help SMEs grow in those poorer places. Or what we're doing in terms of the Global Britain Inward Investment Fund, right? This is about being a bit more competitive. Most other countries are more aggressive than us historically about match funding, gap funding to secure big inward investments again, up in Blythe, like the Gigafactory that they're building up there, and like Nissan in Sunderland, the Envision Nissan investment they made recently. And we are now upping our game to just match a bit more what other countries are doing. And again, that fund is not visible at the point where you announce it, but the point where you get those big inward investments, that is visible. So it's a mix of stuff you can point at and stuff this is a bit less tangible, but create a general sense of prosperity.
With all that on May the 6th, but thank you for that. Let me go to questions. We've got a terrific number of questions, and if you start, right, there's going to be some here as well. Let me start online. Sarah Ayres from the University of Bristol. Do you see tackling health inequalities specifically as an important part of levelling up? Neil, let's start with you, but both of you.
Absolutely. Great question, because we haven't talked too much about that so far. So the white paper talked about the forthcoming health disparities white paper, which will bring a lot of these things together, and things like the tobacco control plan. And I was up in Blackpool last week, and it's very clear the interaction between economic problems and health problems. And it's got higher smoking in pregnancy anywhere in England, certainly maybe in the UK. And it has lots of homes in multiple occupation, some of which are unsafe, and which, you know, white paper has and major announcements in terms of our crackdown on kind of slum landlordism to partly improve health and partly improve the local environment. So those interactions are hugely important and have probably historically been underdone. And I just think, you know, ultimately on public health and on prevention, we just need to think extremely radically and really floor it, because otherwise the NHS will just be under humongous pressure for the rest of our lifetimes because of an ageing population. So you've just got to be very imaginative and aggressive about what we do on some of these prevention efforts. So it's central to levelling up. And it interacts a bit with the devolution point as well, because if you have a strong, particularly single directly elected leader for a health geography, they can be the people who are driving the integration agenda and using their powers to do that.
Indeed, and I was going to mention, during the coronavirus pandemic, I think we saw sort of the benefits, but also some of the downsides of how centralised things are in terms of health. So testing was an example that if we had better local powers for NHS Trust to do their own testing, it could have been done much more effectively. Yet as we saw, it was done locally, then it was pulled back to DH, and eventually we got there. But as we know, in the early stages of the pandemic, our response was very much undermined by our very poor testing capacity, which in turn was linked to our very poor local capacity. And one thing we should mention is, well, many of these places have older populations than the national average and are also getting older as well. And they're the ones who are going to face the biggest challenge with the backlog to the NHS, which is going to be a huge issue for the next 5 years. Plus, obviously, social care issues as well. And time again, when I was travelling around the country, people are so worried about what they're going to do, not for their parents, but also when they're older, what that means to their families. So obviously you brought in the levy, which is coming in from this Friday, I think, is when the NI rise kicks in. But I think, again, it comes back to this very boring point of just delivering this actual change on the ground and making sure local authorities, combined authorities, have the health powers, but also the capacity to be able to build up for their particular local needs, because the health needs of Blackpool are totally different to Manchester.
Okay, thank you for those. I'm going to take a pair of questions now online, then I'm coming to the room. One from Jonathan Bunn of the PA, saying, for Neil, but Sebastian, you can answer as well, what is the current makeup of the Levelling Up Task Force, and will a new permanent secretary responsible for levelling up be appointed when Andy Haldane departs? That's Andy Haldane, who was the chief economist of the Bank of England on a six-month secondment in that role before going to the RSA. And the second question, if you hold your thought on that, is from Peter Mandelson, who is a Labour... Sorry, Peter Mandelson, to put you second on this, but as a Labour former minister on this as part of the long history of the subject. And he says levelling up requires fundamental economic structural change, but the government's industrial strategy was abolished by the Treasury, and the Industrial Policy Council, chaired by Andy Haldane, disbanded. How does Neil reconcile this with the aims of the white paper? Neil, why don't you go first? And then I'd love Sebastian's views.
Two totally great questions. So on the former, initially, when we started work on the white paper, we had a task force in the Cabinet Office. We had a kind of small unit working out of kind of number 10 Cabinet Office to start to coordinate Whitehall on this. We were then upgraded in the autumn to having the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, and to Michael Gove, I think, without blowing our own trumpet, widely regarded as one of the most experienced and effective Cabinet Ministers leading things. Although Andy was always a sort of temporary person, because he also runs the RSA. That task force has now been folded fully into the department, which now is the kind of voice in Whitehall for driving this agenda forward. And to Peter's perfectly sort of reasonable point, obviously, much of the learning we did from the prior industrial strategy, and I mentioned a bit of that earlier on, has flowed straight into this directly via Andy Haldane and the focus that he brought onto continuity and long-term missions. That's why we've got the 12 missions. The focus that he brought to us on kind of metrics and data and improving data Seb's got his, delightfully, beautifully written, thrilling book. I've also got this exciting document, free to download, which describes our kind of approach to improving data, because in so many fields, Whitehall just doesn't have its act together. But there is a difference, actually, between the prior industrial strategy and the levelling up agenda, which is a bit wider. We already talked about health being in there, which wasn't really part of the industrial strategy. So it is a different thing. We do have an advisory council on this as well, so we continue to talk to external experts as well and to local stakeholders right across the UK. But it is a slightly different thing. But we have drawn on a lot of the fantastic work that was done by the Industrial Strategy Council. It's about not chopping and changing, point the Institute for Government also made, about having long-term consistency, about having local leadership. So all those kind of lessons have been pulled into it, and indeed some of the lessons that we take from previous programs like Peter's the Ninja agenda, the new industries, new jobs agenda, and some of the things that we've learned from Peter.
The only thing I'd add to that briefly is that there's obviously this ideological tension which you can see about you want to be interventionist in some respects, but also I think one of the things that sets out levelling up from previous attempts, Neil, is to foster as much of the private sector as possible, because so many of these places you highlighted in the white paper just don't get strong enough levels of private sector investment. And one of the things that I think Andy Haldane and Michael Gove have talked about is devolving some tax-raising powers, which is something that would allow regions to, again, try and be more competitive, encourage more business investment. And I think the science and technology stuff is very good at fostering innovation through industrial strategy, but there's only so much you can do there, because if you end up just piling public money into it, which I think is what has happened in the past, then when you hit your next inevitable downturn, it then all loses it, and then you end up people just feeling even more annoyed than they were in the first place. So it feels to me there is like a sort of tension there between what you're trying to get at.
A bit, I suppose. I think that things like government relocations, moving Treasury to Darlington, are important because they are signalling, as well as bringing new high-skilled jobs to that place, deepening a labour market for highly skilled people. You're also signalling this is a place that you might want to invest as a private sector investor. But that can't be the end of it, because it has to be the wider private sector. And a lot of what we are doing in the white paper is exactly about that. So take another example. We said that Homes England would get back into the business of urban regeneration, which sort of slightly got lost in the creation of the HCA. We talked about 20 places where we'll do sort of major King's Cross style regeneration, where they will use their powers, their funding and so on to regenerate areas. But they're not just doing that by spending public money. The whole point of the exercise is to create an investable pipeline for the private sector, because what's happened, to Seb's point, over the last 20 or more years is that unless you are one of the very biggest cities in the UK in kind of commercial property, a lot of institutional investors have pulled out, and there's been a huge drain of money. And they don't want to be exposed to just one place. They want a diversified pool that they can invest into, and they don't want to take a load of risk and have to have, high cost of capital, high margin. They would like, ideally, someone like Homes England, like government, to create investable propositions, to work up schemes for massive regeneration of a kind that are needed in pretty much every one of our cities because of pandemic and online shopping and so on. And to create a de-risk proposition that institutional money can then flow into, even sovereign money potentially. And so it's all about us being catalytic, us trying to create investable propositions, and trying to get, using our relatively, always in the grand scheme of things, small amount of taxpayers' funding to unlock bigger amounts of that private sector funding, and that's what will really change the regeneration. I mean, by the way, I think that the scale of the task in every city and town is so monumental. I mean, just so many places that were shopping places that we are all shopping online that will not reverse, and they will need to become places for leisure, living, working, as well as just shopping. And that is a huge physical change where there is a sensible role. It isn't a freedom marketeer. There's a sensible role for local leadership politically and for central government, because there's just a collective action problem. The land's all held by different people. Yeah. You can't just change the use of one shop into a house. That's not adding a lot of value. I'm going to come back actually to that point and local government finances in a second. Let me take one here. Two here even. Let's have them both.
Neil and Sebastian. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can do.
Could you say?
Ian Morling, Winchester Partners. Picking up on exactly what you were just saying at the end, On the train coming up, I flicked through the white paper again, and the one thing which was missing was the private sector engagement. You talk about human skills, but you don't talk about entrepreneurs, risk takers. And that's one of the remarkable things about today, is the desire of so many of the younger generations to be entrepreneurs, to be risk takers, and therefore to generate jobs locally even from these individuals. So private sector, yes. Big corporations, yes. But the government money can be used to support and create pools of entrepreneurs around the country. Peter Ormerod on Rochdale was saying he wanted to have better housing there so you could keep some of the brighter young people to live there. It makes a lot of sense. Second thing, which you and I spoke about at one stage, Neil, is the buy-in from MPs, from the parliamentary party. And the ONS has a remarkable, long-standing set of statistics of industrial employment. So according to the SIC's categories, it's a survey done every month or every quarter, and we can create images at constituency level of what's going on. And I think that will make a lot of difference to get a buy-in from local MPs. If you're only dealing with local authorities, you're never going to get the buy-in from the local MPs.
Mm-hmm. Thank
so
you very
both
much.
of those are questions.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm so sorry, I didn't catch your name. Is it Ian? It was Ian. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, hi, John Godfrey from Legal and General. Just a quick question. We're big fans of what you're trying to do with the Levelling Up white paper. Devolution is clearly helpful. The availability of private sector capital exists and it can be leveraged in. You've alluded to that. One of the things that will make that happen is a focus on delivery, which is as laser sharp and as organized as Andy Haldane's focus has been on the intellectual framework. So the question would be, could you think about, alongside the Levelling Up directors who are the advocates in particular places, could you think about something which is designed at the centre or locally to help local government deliver this stuff at scale and at pace in time, hopefully for the next election or not long after?
Okay, thank you both. Ian, John, go ahead.
Just about focus on the private sector. I do think actually that is quite through the white paper. We do talk about it a reasonable amount. The very first objective is boosting productivity, pay, jobs by living standards by growing the private sector. So it's built into the very first line of the first objective, and it does through the document. But it's a completely fair point to keep to press on this point and about the importance of MP buy-in, which we're trying to do through both the DEVO deals and also through things like Shared Prosperity Fund in the design of them. And to John's point, you mentioned the Levelling Up directors, which for those who don't follow it, we already have a thing called the Cities and Local Growth Unit, which is a joint project between BEIS and our department, which is a contact point for local leaders, local authorities, and so on to interface with Whitehall. We're going to hugely upgrade that with these regional directors who will be very high profile, high influence people who can kind of knock heads together and be the voice of local places in Whitehall to go and make sure that we are pulling together all the things that they need, partly for the devolution deals, but partly more generally. Because I do think one of the best things about the city devolution process that we began in 2014 has been the ability of that to put issues of local importance onto the Whitehall agenda. You know, if you have been complaining for many years as a local place about a particular junction, the lack of some grid connection, the opportunity presented by some new industry or a cultural project, you can finally get that, you know, taken up to the highest level in Whitehall as part of that devolution process. So as well as all the things that they do generically in terms of devolving decision-making power, bringing a coherent strategy to a place, it's also an opportunity to just get Whitehall to know its way around the world a bit better.
I do wonder, though, if there needs to be some sort of Michael Barvin-style delivery unit on a national scale for this, because really, if you break this down, you're talking about thousands of small-scale infrastructure projects. And what I do wonder is, obviously, given there is this political imperative for the government to try and get some progress in the next 2 years, but then the 8-year aims on top of that as well, you're putting a large sum of money into some places that, again, are they able to cope with that? Because one of the places I've been to is Workington in the northwest, and Allerdale Borough Council, their normal capital spend is £4 million a year. They're getting £25 million in one lump from the Levelling Up Fund, which in the scheme of Whitehall spending is not a lot, but for them it's a huge amount. And when I went round Workington town centre, they pointed to me all the things that happened last time they got money, including glass roof over the shopping centre, which is now all cracked, a modernist clock which is now broken, and toilets that are also broken as well. So when you look at that, a lot of people say, well, we had all this money, we spent it before, it didn't change it, the town has still got the same problems, and the infrastructure 20 years on is kind of withered. So what I just wonder is there not scope for something at a national level that is looking at how this money is spent? Is it being used effectively? Who's monitoring the suppliers? Is it being delivered on time? Is the money being wasted? Because you're putting a lot of onus on local councils to do that.
No, you're absolutely right, and that's why all the different bits of the rewiring that we've talked about so far are being put in place. So the overall missions, the metrics that sit behind them.
Yeah, but rewiring is a metaphor. I'm getting a lot of questions about particularly money at the local council level, saying local government has been very short of money for many years. It's yes.
It's run out of money as well.
It's run out of money. That's not going to be. That's not going to be that particular problem. Sit very still. But I'm getting a lot of questions, as I said, about whether local councils are very strained and this all puts too much weight on them, and should they not get more powers to do something about council tax and business rates. You can hold that thought for a moment, but I've got a whole bunch of questions here. Have we got some more in the room? Let's come to these two here.
Hi, I'm Caitlin at the Yorkshire Post. You've touched on it briefly, but recently there were some ads put out for the Levelling Up director roles, I think at a salary of £140,000, including a number on my patch. What's going to be expected of these people is still quite vague. Do you have any more detail on what's going to be expected of them on a day-to-day basis? Are they going to be like spokespeople? Are they going to function like mayors? Are they going to be senior civil servants? And in addition to that, do you think that there'll be more pressure for them to deliver quickly, given the cost of living crisis and the size of those salaries, especially if they're working in areas which may have salaries that are smaller than the national average?
Yes.
Thank you. And can we take
do you mind if we quickly just answer
all right,
that
go
particular
on,
point? Because there's so many specific points there. So they will not be spokespeople, and they will not be mayors. We can't replicate the roles of the mayors that are there. They will be senior civil servants. They will, for those kind of salaries, we will only appoint these people if they are people of extremely high calibre and heft and ability to make things happen. I think in our first experiment with this in the Northwest, it is making a big difference for places like Blackpool. We're conscious that it's a lot of money, and so it has to deliver for people in Yorkshire, and it has to serve every part of Yorkshire and indeed Humber as well. To help the places where we've already got mayors and those who are trying to negotiate devolution deals to get what they need out of Whitehall, and to know where to find the right person and how to unlock, make the magic happen in Whitehall. And to be able to help them strategically. We talked about this point about capacity, that there will be someone who works for all these local places to help them form their strategies in conjunction with the local councils and the MCAs that are there already. So it's really there to serve local leaders and local people in Yorkshire.
Okay, let's go here.
Hi, I'm Alita Adji from the Daily Mirror. Levelling Up funds were initially awarded to Tory MPs. To the local councils of Tory MPs. We heard of Sajid Javid's constituency of Bromsgrove getting around £40 million. And off the back of the Chancellor's spring statement, we now know that almost 1 million people will be plunged into poverty, 500,000 children included. Do you think this has been the best way to show off the government's flagship policy of levelling up? And also, you have previously expressed your concerns about the Partygate scandal. We now know that more than 20 people have been fined for attending these lockdown-breaching parties. at Downing Street, and the Prime Minister has previously said that all the rules were followed. Do you think he is the best man to be leading the country at the moment, to be leading this levelling up agenda?
Thank you. Neil.
So on the different funds, they are all objectively done and weighted towards the needs of real places. So the Towns Fund is only available for the most deprived half of towns. The Levelling Up Fund runs off of an index which is published, which is a mixture of the different aspects of deprivation, and then is objectively assessed by civil servants and ranks, and we have no say over that, and we just fund down the list according to what the assessment of those bids is for civil servants. With the Shared Prosperity Fund, which will be an allocation rather than a competition, that will be done with a strong, I can promise you, a strong weighting towards those places with the greatest need. You know, if you look at the Levelling Up Fund, something like 3/4 of all the money has gone into those top priority places, many of which, by the way, have Labour MPs, and a huge number of shadow cabinet members have also received some of those Levelling Up funds. But you know, if you think about this agenda in the wider space, you know, we are talking about huge changes to get more of housing spend, not just in the capital and the Greater South East and the most affluent parts of the UK. We're talking about doing the same thing for research and development. We're talking about all these different things that are driving growth and prosperity towards the poorer parts of these countries. And many of those places have local Labour councils or local Labour MPs. And I think one of the things that's been attractive about this programme and about the devolution programme more generally has been that whatever happens at the national level and the normal partisan knockabout, we have managed to work constructively with councils, whatever their political persuasion is, to try and achieve some of the things that they know have needed doing for a very long time. So I don't think the tenor of your question is correct at all.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to take one more in the room and then a few more online, and then we're going to have to wrap up. So one more over here. All right, if that's going to take a bit of acrobatics, not at all. Many thanks.
Hi, Richard Parry from Quattro. I was interested to hear you say that investment in housing and transport in the South East can be a vicious circle and pour fuel on the fire of the existing problems. Do you think that part of levelling up is not just increasing house building investment in the north and left behind areas, but also reducing it and easing it in the South East?
I think there is a win-win, yes, absolutely. That, you know, if you look internationally, there is a clear correlation between places that have a stronger economy overall and places that have a more balanced economy. And it's not hard to see why that would be, because if you have an economy where parts of it are overheating, people got to afford a house, they got to get on the train in the morning, and at the same time you have places that are, you know, crying out for more jobs and investment, where assets they've got are underused, you can see the scope for a win-win that will raise the overall economic performance of the country. Now, getting some cities that have lost population over the last 30 years growing more strongly will take a degree of pressure off the housing need and pressures in the overheating parts of the country. They can't take them away, right? They can't stop the need for significant house building in affluent places, but they can take the pressure off a bit and make the economy stronger overall, I think.
Okay, I'm going to read out a batch of ones online and use it as a prompt for last thoughts from both of you. Though I would throw in one particular, just a comment or question from Vernon Bogdanor, saying some health functions have been devolved to Greater Manchester to integrate with social care. Many hope that this could be a model for other combined authorities, but the outcomes so far appear to have been disappointing. Why is this? Might tuck that in. But I've got a lot really about first place, what role do cities have and what role does London have? Is there any protection for rural areas in this? Are they going to get their fair share? About accountability between Whitehall and local authorities as this money begins to move, and why are we talking just about England as we appear to be, not about Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland? Don't they deserve their share of levelling up? I've summarised in that great kind of patches of questions. Thank you very much. People have put them very subtly, very well, and there are many on the same themes. So perhaps each of you would like to talk about these. What is Sebastian? Why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think the role of cities is a very crucial one here, because obviously some of the first...
You've just written a great piece in the FT, Don't Level Down London, or I'm paraphrasing.
Exactly. I was just going to punt my wares once again. But yeah, I think this is when you obviously look at what's happening with London's transport, which is a huge problem, that essentially for 2 years no one used TfL, and the government's put £5 billion, which sounds like a huge amount of money into the system, but there's still no long-term funding plan for TfL. And they've already had to mothball Crossrail 2, which was, I think, a project first started by Boris Johnson. They've had to mothball the extension of the Bakerloo line. They've also had to mothball the new trains for the Bakerloo line, which are now which will be 70 years old by the time they're eventually replaced in late 2030s or early 2040s. Now, of course, governments can't do everything. You've got huge other priorities in terms of recovering from the pandemic. But I think there is certainly a mindset of certainly some MPs that it's very much you have to level down London to level up elsewhere. And I think if you went to a lot of focus groups in these places, some people might have that perception as well. They like the idea that our national discourse is focused on towns and places that have not been spoken of. But you've got to keep in fact the economic importance of London and other cities. You know, London contributes before the pandemic £36 billion to the Exchequer, 22% of UK GDP. And the stat that TfL love is that for every £1 spent on London transport investment, 55p of it goes to jobs outside of London. So the new Piccadilly line trains are being built in Goole, in Yorkshire, and the new net zero buses are being built in Northern Ireland, in Scarborough. So I think it is very important in all this as well to realise that, yes, you might want to take some of the economic heat off the southeast and try and create jobs and target investment there, but not at the deprivation of London. And the kind of thing you could do very easily is just sort TfL's funding, get it a medium-term solution. You know, London is the only...
Did you say very easily?
Those are the words that I also...
We may be in the closing minute, but I can't let that go by.
Well, I was going to say, London is the only city that gets no central government funding for its transport system, and it was cut in 2015. There is a very easy way to solve it for you. There's just more money to answer to everything.
No, it was devolved in 2015. So London, in a sense, is the model for what we need to do for other places. So, as you know, London's economic performance has pulled away from the rest of the country over the period that we have data for since 1997. Gone from being about 30% higher income compared to 70% higher income. So it's done very well. And we have, you know, absolutely all the parts of the UK economy are connected. No desire at all to do down in London. It's crucial for other parts of the country for all the reasons that Seb mentions. But nonetheless, we've actually got to do for some of the other places what we did for London. We made major capital investments to help build its independent fare box, so it doesn't need to get the central government direct funding anymore. So, you know, we built the Jubilee line, we built Crossrail, we built the M25 and so on and so forth. You know, all major cultural investments, you know, multiple times higher than the rest of the country. Huge concentration of R&D spending. So it had the tools to become self-sufficient. That's what other places want. They don't want handouts. They want to be able to be self-sufficient in the way that London is. And on the UK, I don't think we have been talking about England. We've been talking about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which is something we're doing across all of the UK. We're talking about R&D and the Glasgow Innovation Accelerator, something we do across all of the UK. You know, we need to respect the devolution settlements for Scottish Government, Welsh Government, Northern Ireland Executive and so on. We do respect them. We're trying to always have the right working relationship with them, but nonetheless, where there are UK-wide things like net zero agenda, big opportunities in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as well, and we want to make sure that we are playing our part too while respecting the role of those devolved governments at the same time. It's absolutely a UK-wide mission, and although there's serious poverty in parts of London, and someone who did 6 years of outreach for 6 years of work with street homeless people in London, I'm very conscious of the real poverty there is in London. But there are also places of great deprivation in Wales and Northern Ireland and indeed parts of Scotland as well, even though it's quite a strong economy overall. So absolutely UK-wide agenda, no desire to do down London whatsoever, rather an attempt to replicate some of the things that have gone right for the capital in some other places too.
Okay, well, on that note, we are going to have to stop. We have thanks to everyone's terrific questions and the patience of the two panellists. We've gone 3 minutes over, which breaks one of my rules at the IFG, but it's been an absolutely fascinating session. I'm sorry I couldn't get more questions in. So it just remains for me to thank you all online and in the room, for us all to thank our two panellists, and then the people in the room can go home by TfL, thus adding to its very easily repaired finances. Thank you all, and thank you, Neil O'Brien, Sebastian Payne.